Right, so my paper is called The Walls of Shakespeare and Company. And you might know that there are actually two Shakespeare and Companies. There was the original, which is what I'm talking about. And I think I might touch on the contemporary one as well a little bit, but I want to just make that distinction clear from the start here. So Sylvia Beach's bookshop in Paris, Shakespeare and Company, operated from 1919 until 1941. And its walls were covered in photographs, mostly portraits of writers. So here, right off the bat, you see this shot of the exterior of Shakespeare and Company with Sylvia Beach standing under her sign. I think, allegedly, she's putting the sign up of Shakespeare. In Hemingway's posthumous autobiography, A Movable Feast, from 1964, which describes his time in Paris in the 1920s, he remarks, "On a cold, wind-swept street, this was a warm, cheerful place, with a big stove in winter, tables and shelves of books, new books in the window, and photographs on the wall of famous writers, both dead and living. The photographs all looked like snapshots, and even the dead writers looked as though they had really been alive." End quote. Because of these images and Beach's general warm, home-like interior design, the physical space of the shop has itself become legendary, apart from its notoriety as publisher of Joyce's Ulysses, or for bringing together expat and French writers and the artists of the lost generation. It influenced, to say the least, the contemporary Shakespeare and Company of George Whitman, which itself has become a legend and a landmark in operation since 1951. And one of these anthology chapters that I have forthcoming for a while now is about that, the history and the connection between the two shops, and the kind of apocryphal information you get as to how they may or may not be related. George himself, who passed away now, almost 2 years ago now, I think, told me when he was 98, he told me that Sylvia Beach, what did he say? He took the name Shakespeare and Company for his shop without asking her, because he was afraid she would say no, although he knew she would say yes. But then there are other versions where he may have said he did ask her. So anyway, he told me this, you know, take it with a grain of salt, when he was like 96 years old. So. Anyway, okay, so Beach created that physical space in her shop to be comfortable and aesthetically pleasing, but also imaginative. One thinks of the bust of Shakespeare known as her, what she called her partner Bill, or of the original Walt Whitman manuscripts on the wall. So it is this deliberate literary yet human design, so these two things, the literary and the human, that has since intrigued literary historians, if for no other reason than to get hold of the tangible, the very tangible mystery of that atmosphere. We seek a glimpse not simply of the images, but of the collective effect of the images. Therein rests not only a desire to inhabit the space of the shop as it would have felt to Beach's patrons, but also a desire to reflect on the space as itself a historical representation of literary history. We view the bookshop with nostalgia through its photographs, while the photographs themselves serve as emblems of nostalgia for Sylvia and her well-known patrons, thinking already that they're hanging on the walls. And I just want to interject one point from Nicholas's paper. What I thought of could add to mine is, I want to ask this kind of rhetorically and then maybe really ask it at the end, is can there be nostalgia without this transcendental homelessness? Can there be kind of a positive nostalgia? Because my approach here, I'm talking more about the pleasure in the reflecting on these images. But we have two layers here. We have Beach and her patrons' nostalgia of the images, and then we have ours of that, which is what I want to show you here. So I'm going to show you the pictures. Many of the photographs were taken by Giselle Freund and Man Ray, but also several unknown photographers, depicting, for example, the Fitzgeralds at Christmas time, or Hemingway posing nude on the beach with nothing but a fig leaf, The latter I sadly do not have, but the former will be in the collection of the Fitzgeralds kicking up a leg. Man Ray once explained, quote, "I photograph the things I do not wish to paint, the things which already have an existence," end quote. It is this existence that the photographs portray, an existence that, as Hemingway notes, comes through in the photographs even among the dead writers, and which gives the legend of Beach's shop that very strong tangible quality. The images hold a mystique that is centered upon both the shop's literary heritage, as I said, as well as the actual heritage of the very real patrons at the time, through, again, this lens of nostalgia, which I would say in a Proustian reflective or mnemonic sense doubles the charm of its effects through the material and very faded quality now of those living snapshots. So thinking about them being nostalgic for us 100 years later, nearly 100 years later, but thinking about them hanging on the walls because they are already emblems of nostalgia for Sylvia Beach. Okay, so let's look at the photographs. I would first like to show you a series of photos of the shop itself. So just various ones I could bring together. Here we have Beach with James Joyce out in front of the shop. And then here we have Adrienne Monnier, Sylvia Beach's, are these clear, by the way? I never even had to ask. Her partner who ran the shop across the street called La Maison des Amis des Livres. So the friends, the house of the friends of books across the street. So they were just like bringing in all the literary favorites of Paris, the French and the Anglo and so on. Let's see. Here's one we have Hemingway, Injured, and Beach, and I'm not sure who the other folks are. If anyone out there is more of an expert on some of these images, feel free to chime in. I'm trying to remember, the injury on Hemingway was, this isn't a war injury. This is, he like slipped on the toilet. Yeah, he slipped like pulling the chain or something, and it was this, he wanted people to forget about it, so it's kind of good I don't quite remember. He was really embarrassed, and you know, he had this big gash. He has like a scar. Okay, so here we've got Sylvia in the shop, and then so now we have a series of Adrienne Monnier and Sylvia Beach sitting with James Joyce, which were actually publicity shots before Ulysses came out. So there's a few of these. And in these interior shots, you can start to see what's going on in the background. Here you start to see a ton of the portraits in the corner. So slightly rhetorical, I want to ask, why did Beach cover her walls with photos of her patrons? What did it mean then and now? So these images are often nothing more than the snapshots or personal portraits for remembrance, kind of like headshots, like movie star headshots. And I was introduced as a scholar of, I forget how you put it, modernism photography. I'm not a photography expert. So I actually want to ask if anybody does know, was it very common for writers to have headshots like this? Or were these like calling cards? I'm not really sure. So we'll see a ton of these hanging on the wall. So here's a lot more. There's a nice broader shot of the shop. You can see all of the headshots. So some are simply snapshots and personal portraits and have value mainly because of the subject or the subject's signed inscription. So a lot of these are signed, obviously. And the snapshots that convey the walls of Shakespeare and Company's collected snapshots themselves provide a further deeper layer to this nostalgia that subsequent generations like us feel when examining the historic bookshop's legacy. Both sets of aging photographs are aesthetically pleasing in themselves. So, for example, Man Ray's shot of William Carlos Williams that we'll see in a moment says as much about the shop in that time as it does about the poet, right? So the character of the locale is immediately present as well as the realness of the writer. One also feels Sylvia Beach through each image, her proprietary satisfaction to have these moments of each writer captured in a moment forever on her wall, and for us, that wall forever historically. So let's see some more. And there we have Adrienne in her shop. So she also had a collection, which I'm not talking about here, but and she's here posing with her books, her collection. And here we are back in Beach's shop. Here she is posing with her collection, this like publicity shot. You can start to maybe recognize a couple. You see D.H. Lawrence and Hemingway. So I've, and here is actually a picture of T.S. Eliot giving a reading at the shop, which I think is fabulous. When I see this, I think about who are the other people in the background, forever captured in this kind of literary history. Okay, so here I've got all of the shots that I extracted from the wall. I haven't been to, this collection is all in Princeton, and so I've sought out, cut them out of the larger pictures and tried to figure out who they are. So there are actually a few I don't know that I'll show you at the end, so if anybody recognizes who these folks are, that would be fabulous. So I do believe that that first shot is T.S. Eliot and his wife. I tried to find the exact image as it was on the wall, but sometimes I just couldn't find it, so I've just put up one so we can see each of them. And so what I'd like to do is just, as I go through these, I want to read a passage, very short, basically give you a glimpse into Sylvia Beach's connection to each of these writers, as she noted in her autobiography, Shakespeare and Company. So actually with this T.S. Eliot, I'm going to quote from Hemingway, for starters, where he says, "Ezra worried about everyone," so Ezra Pound, "worried about everyone. And in the time when I first knew him, he was most worried about T.S. Eliot, who, Ezra told me, had to work in a bank in London, and so had insufficient time and bad hours to function as a poet." So some of you may know they kind of pooled their money together to sort of rescue T.S. Eliot from his bank job. And safe to say, I think he made it out. He became, his reputation kind of was established. Okay, so of course James Joyce, this one is actually the actual poet. I don't think I have a passage about him, which is fine. We know that she published Ulysses, and they had a very long, in fact I'd have to probably read the whole book out to you to talk about the kind of difficult, very strong, and what's the word, legendary relationship between Sylvia Beach and James Joyce. Then we have George Antheil, or he was American, so I'm not sure. Antheil, I don't actually know how he pronounced that. So let me give you his passage. She says, "George's tastes and mine, as far as Ulysses was concerned, were similar. It works," said George. He spoke of it as though it were a mechanical invention. He dreamed of composing an opera inspired by Ulysses, but unfortunately he never produced it. So George was a musician. Then we have Breyer. I think I've got, well, sort of close. Breyer was more of a patron of the arts. She was incredibly wealthy. Her father at the time was the third wealthiest man who had ever lived in England. He was a ship? Shipping magnate. Yes, thank you. So she financed a lot of the work going on at Shakespeare and Company, and the shop itself, supported the shop itself. Okay, we have Edith Sitwell. This is an incredible photograph that I could not find. It looks sort of like a deathbed portrait, and it isn't, because it was obviously before she was dead. Sorry, a bit of a tautology there. She supposedly was part of the first ever poetry reading at Shakespeare and Company. And according to Noel Riley Fitch, whom you may know wrote, or who you may know wrote, kind of the first and a very important biography on Shakespeare and Company and the Lost Generation. So she claims that there was a big fight between Sitwell and GertrudeStein, where she argued, they were arguing whether or not Ford Madox Ford's wife had left him for another man. But that was apparently the only fight they ever had. So that's important to remember. They got along well, which, I mean, GertrudeStein was kind of a big deal. Okay, George Gershwin. I think we have pretty close right there. George Gershwin was a very, according to Sylvia, she says he was a very attractive, lovable fellow. Well, that's all we need to know. I'm going to read the whole book. George Moore. Was one of her very first customers. So I'm not going to read a passage from everybody, but... And then we have this kind of wonderful Man Ray photograph of Joe Davidson sculpting Gertrude Stein's sculpture. So Davidson himself was, you know, obviously part of the scene, and having guests over his own studio like James Joyce, Gertrude Stein, Clarence Darrow, and he did a very famous sculpture of Whitman back in New York, incidentally. So Beach says, I was delighted to hear that Manhattan was going to honor Walt Whitman and to contribute the gate, oh sorry, no that's not what I wanted to say. Sorry, Joe Davidson had been commissioned to do the statue in New York, at the Battery in New York. It was a sort of walking Walt to symbolize the open road, and wanted me to include a replica of that piece among my exhibits. So I think I have here, yeah, there's Joe Davidson, and then we have Gertrude Stein, who, of course, was also one of her first customers, and who also, of course, eventually fell out over their over the relationship with Joyce, basically. So their relationship, Beach and Stein, remained cordial, but their kind of friendship turned a bit cold because of Joyce. Then we have H.D., the lovely H.D., one of the most admired so-called imagists, as Beach calls her. And she talks about the relationship between H.D. and Breyer. They were a couple at one point. So she says, H.D. was one of the most admired of the so-called imagists, a group which included Ezra Pound, John Gould Fletcher, and others, all of whom were gathered. And then we have Hemingway, whom she calls her best customer. Of course, they were very close. And then we have Catherine Ann Porter. I think I have this one. So you can see there's an inscription there, which I don't know. So she says about Catherine Ann Porter. Catherine Ann had a handsome tomcat named Skipper. His mistress was such a good cook that Skipper began to lose his figure. She invented a sort of Swedish system with pulleys attached to a tree that forced Skipper to do exercises in the garden, but Skipper was not the slim type. Okay. I just thought that was kind of cute. Then we have Katherine Mansfield. We have her actual photograph there, and I don't know that I don't have a passage on Mansfield, unfortunately, but Lawrence. It was sad refusing Lawrence's lady, she says, and it was always, sorry, let me get the full passage. So she was asked to bring out Lady Chatterley's Lover, which she refused, and she was very sad to have refused it, but it just wasn't her cup of tea. It was sad refusing Lawrence's lady, particularly because he was so ill the last time I saw him that he had got out of bed to come to the bookshop and had a flushed, feverish look. It was distressing trying to explain my reasons for not undertaking other publications than Ulysses, lack of capital. But you couldn't persuade anyone that Shakespeare and Company hadn't made a fortune, and that we lacked space, personnel, and time. It was difficult to tell him that I didn't want to get a name as a publisher of erotica, and impossible to say that I wanted to be a one-book publisher. What could anybody offer after Ulysses? I need to find, oh yeah, right here. D.H. Lawrence was a man of great personal charm. It was always a matter of wonder to me why a writer so greatly gifted never seemed to have the power to produce what his readers were expecting of him. And I really love that passage. I don't think we have time to go into it, but I think it's really fascinating, that idea. Okay, so then we have Valerie, and yeah, he was a very good friend. I'll just leave it at that. Stephen Spender. So Spender read with Hemingway. Hemingway, basically, Beach says that Hemingway only finally agreed to read in public if Spender would do so with him, which I didn't know before I read this text. I thought that was interesting that Hemingway didn't want to read.
Really sorry to cut him, but
yes,
it's getting
oh, okay.
time.
I'll just, oh, geez, okay.
Okay.
I'll just finish showing the images. I think I already showed this one. We have Wilder, also a very good friend. I mean, they're all good friends. Woolf, and the image I was speaking of, and Wyndham Lewis, one of her first customers, and finally Yeats, who was the first subscriber to Ulysses. And then there's the wonderful Fitzgerald's kicking up their heels at Christmas time. And then just real swiftly, I'll show you these if anybody has an idea. So there's the first gal. There's like 5 of them. I just can't make them out. Well, of course that one. And I think that's it. Yeah, that's it. Okay. Let me just read one last sentence. So each image, due to the time that has transpired since it simply resided on her wall, has dimmed, giving the moment and the figure an even deeper regression into history as we, the contemporary viewers, try to recast the world then, projecting ourselves back through the window into the bookshop from one image to the wall itself full of images. Thank you very much.